Well, I was born in the town of Sevenoaks, and where my local parish church, St Nicholas, were one time home of John Donne, the great metaphysical poet. It was a good Anglican church, and I think, like many people growing up in small towns, actually the church was it was a hub of sociality. It provided things like youth clubs, etc., etc. It was a place I first had my first cigarette, first snogged a girl, all those kinds of things. Played dangerous music, etc. It was a social centre. I went to a C of E school. Like many children of that era, I attended Sunday school. So, the question of God in that sense was always something that was in the horizon of my life and my experience. I think it was facilitated growing up in the 80s by none other than Mrs. Thatcher. It was very difficult in that sense to grow up with that hard drive towards sort of, economic materialism. It's not how much money you've got, it's how much money you can borrow, etc. Growing up in that environment, it's difficult not to arrive at the conclusion that whatever the world is, it is not the way that it was presented, and that there had to be some kind of spiritual depth. And I think in some senses, the modern problematic that people encounter seems to be, how does one believe? I want to believe in a God, but God somehow seems distant, he's not obviously evident, etc., etc. I'm almost inclined to say that for me it was the opposite. I've never really had a problem in believing in God. The problem arises when God is sort of too near and too close. I mean, arguably, this is the problem with fundamentalism, actually. It's not that they don't have enough belief, it's that they believe too much. So yes, I always grew up with a profound interest in all these kinds of things. Like many people, I'm sure that I was a bit of a pick and mix spiritual tourist in my younger years, as any good creative mind should be, and I hope that plays out even today in my interest in ecumenical work and in studying the relationship between religions, something which I'm involved in with the university. But something did occur. Sometime around my 30s, actually, when I actually converted to the Roman Catholic Church. And I suppose at the heart of that decision, I mean, any conversion story that one sort of talks about, I think you have to bear in mind several things. Firstly, there's no one simple reason why one converts, etc. There's no simple reason. Generally, it depends on who you're talking to, and I like to have a stock of about 5 different reasons, depending on actually who it is that I'm talking to. It's a little bit like when you watch a film and you think, you might watch a film and it's not that exciting, and then somebody explains a bit about the film to you after the event, and you actually enjoy the film more afterwards. And I think my conversion was like that. Actually, it was a fairly sort of anodyne sort of experience, but as I move away from it and think about it more, I make it much more exciting.
So it wasn't that you were on a road from Sevenoaks to Damascus and there was a sudden moment?
Well, if one can speak of a sudden moment, and I wouldn't put it in those Pauline Damascus terms, if one can speak of a moment, it was a Christmas Eve, it was a midnight mass. Packed church, middle class, mums and dads, children, toddlers in prams, etc. And when it came to the end of the service, the vicar said, if anybody wants to stay behind for the Eucharist, then they're very welcome to. And quite frankly, I was shocked to watch the whole of the church empty out, except for a handful of people, myself included, prepared to share the Eucharist. And it really set me thinking about the centrality of the Eucharist, the idea of the Mass, what it is that we do when we come to celebrate together. And in my own doctoral research, it actually pushed me very hard to think around these questions. And in some respects, I like to joke to myself that in order to continue my thinking about it, I had to sort of, in order to really understand what was going on in the Eucharist, I had to sort of convert to Catholicism just to understand. And now I'm sort of stuck with it. But it wasn't as I say, it wasn't a big Damascus Road experience. I had a friend who converted, around the same time, and I said to him, well, why have you converted to Catholicism? And he said it was the nearest church to me. And of course, the Protestant in me wanted to say, what? You don't really believe in the Pope and all that stuff, etc.? And then I thought about it, and he actually did the most Catholic thing, which is to support the community that he was closest to. So, you know, in many respects, you know, it was a movement of that order. No big wham bam thank you ma'am, but a much more boring, mundane story, but nonetheless one that facilitates my move to a church where, but certainly for me, puts the Eucharist at its heart.
And did that then guide you into working in theology at university, and that all plays part of that?
Well, it would be lovely to think that we actually lived life like that. No, I'm a great believer in what the German philosopher Hegel calls the cunning of reason, that we sort of live our life backwards and we have no self-reflexivity about how we actually arrived and ended up where we arrived. In some respects, I had no intentions of ever really becoming a theologian. All I did at university, and I was very clear, I went to university when I was quite late, actually. I think I was 27. And in those years between leaving school and going to university, I led the high life. I had a guitar on my back. I sort of floated around the world and lived the romantic life of a busker. It was very exciting. When I went to university, I went to do theology. It's because, I was clear about that. But all I ever did at university was I tried to do my best. I worked my hardest for my papers. I read as much as I could. And I really have no reflexivity about how quiet I ended up at Durham. I'm aware that I went for an interview, etc., but no, I had no desire to be a theologian, but I am a theologian.
So for us lay people, is there kind of one theological idea that really sort of grabs you, that you'd like to share?
Well, you know what it's like when you're young and everybody was into music, and you'd meet somebody and you'd sort of ask them about what kind of music they liked, etc. Well, I sort of thought about this question, and I sort of came up with this question about doctrine. So for a while, whenever I would bump into a priest, I'd always ask them, well, what's your favourite piece of doctrine? So I'm familiar in some senses with the question. Of course, if you ask a Catholic priest, it's always, well, it'll be the Eucharist, etc., etc. But for me, it's the question of creation. For me, the doctrine of creation holds profound importance because it seems to inform just so much of what it is simply to be a social being. And it puts into perspective that theology is this is not just some sort of pie in the sky thinking about God. No, it is the way that thinking about God actually allows us to think much more seriously about what it is to be a society and a social being. And if you get your foundations right, probably not unlike the story of the man who builds his house in sand, if you get your foundations right, then I think you can start to work towards a better society. And our foundations lie in the doctrine of creation. I mean, let's put it simply. When God creates the world, or indeed the cosmos, he creates it with love. He doesn't say, well, there's a whole bunch of competing selfish individuals that we need to control and impose some law on to ensure the smooth running of the cosmos. No, he creates in plenitude. It's a pure outpouring of charity. And in fact, even scientifically, you cannot say that the will to power, which is largely how we operate today, is more primary than the will to charity. And yet the whole assumptions of our social life are built on the idea that we as humans and individuals are self-seeking individuals and will operate to secure our own private sphere of power. Well, the doctrine of creation says something totally different, and I don't think that even scientifically you can show how the story of power is more primary than the story of charity. And I think if we start with the doctrine of creation, which privileges the idea of charitable love as the outworking of creation, I think as a basis for society, at the very minimum, it offers hope in a way that no account of the secular society can